Hello everybody, it's Burton's middle class review for September 2019. Now here's a topic that's pretty big at the moment. It's about climate change, climate activism, global warming, blah blah blah, and how this actually affects the middle class. So I'll actually be posting, quite interestingly, on my middle class review page and on my own personal page, I'll be posting later a video from a rather wealthy guy discussing with an Australian lady about why the whole climate change business is a hoax and it's to make money and it's a scam. But that's just one opinion, but please watch it when I post it later. It's always good to open your mind, look at different views. But I'm just looking at things from my own research and views and, you know, just seeing how all this stuff affects the middle class, working class, etc. Because I want to see people lifted up, of course. So, talking about it's people are saying things like unite behind the science and take action on climate change. Now they're saying this to Westerners, but they don't seem to be directing it at the biggest polluters in the world like China and India. But anyway, I'll come to that later. But to me, I actually look at scientific method. Now I had a former girlfriend who had a PhD in science. She was into science. She explained science to me in 7 different steps, which was good. She said scientific method, basically you have 7 steps. You've got 1, your research and data collection. 2, there's analysis and evaluation. 3, form conclusions. 4, implications and predictions. 5, review, critique and debate with other scientists. And 6, re-evaluation, reassessment. 7, repeat step 1. Okay, so science is like constantly evolving, okay? They're constantly debating, coming up with better conclusions, etc. as time goes on. So you never say, well, the science is final, that's it, okay? Never. Once you do that, basically, you're not a scientist anymore. But this is according to a scientist. Okay, but anyway, this is my observation of the scientific method of climate change. I think there's only 5 steps at the moment. There's like number 1, you form conclusions. 2, fit data to conclusions. 3, fit predictions to conclusions. 4, make policy demands. And 5, denounce and deplatform dissenters. So anybody you don't like, just crap on them. Don't let them have a voice. No debate allowed. I find too, the thing is with scientists, they get a lot of money from government and they get grants. I remember my former partner, she got grants from BHP and Rio Tinto. Yes, coal and iron ore mining companies. I know, the duality of these people is quite interesting. But anyway, there's actually the supposed leaders of the climate change debate now. I see them posted on social media and all this stuff by very well-meaning people. And there's one called Greta Thunberg from Sweden. She's a 16-year-old girl with Asperger's. And I thought, wow, what a perfect person to choose to be the spokesperson for this movement. Because you can't really criticize a girl, especially one with Asperger's. I mean, in this day and age, that's just like heresy to do so. But I'm not going to attack her personally. I don't care if she's a girl or 16 or has Asperger's. I think she speaks very good English, actually. So she's obviously had some education. But she says things, I'll actually look at some of her quotes and I actually think it's pretty hypocritical. But she's like a lot of these climate activists, I find them complete hypocrites. And here's why. She says, I saw in one interview, she says, I don't tell anyone what to do or what not to do. Interesting. That was one of her earliest quotes I saw. And then she told government leaders, you are acting like spoiled, irresponsible children. And then she said, I want you to panic. I want you to act as if the house is on fire. Okay? And she says, leave the oil in the ground. Now, Greta, that sounds like you are telling people what to do and what not to do, okay? Now, quite frankly, I don't agree with that whole oil in the ground business because without petrochemicals, petrochemical fertilizers, according to a scientific study I read over 10 years ago, they said that at least 1/3 of the world's population was starved to death. And I remember one year in the noughties when the oil price went over $150 a barrel US, okay, US dollars, that's pretty big. 100 million people started to starve in the world. Now that's the figures that I got from World Vision. That's a charity that I support. And they said people were starving. And I mean, I noticed watching on the news, they had like people in Egypt, not just like poor African countries where people are starving. No, this was Egypt. You know, the place where they used to have the big, it was the grain bowl for the Roman Empire all those years ago. Yeah, well, people were starving there because the food price had doubled because the cost of oil had gone up. Oil and fuel. Now you need diesel. You need petrochemical fertilizers to sustain modern farming these days. And You know, there were women who had 4 or 5 kids in Egypt and they said, I can't feed my children, I can't afford the price of rice. Wheat had doubled. I mean, how the hell can they survive when they're only living on a couple of bucks a day or something? Now, for Westerners, it wasn't such a big deal. Oh, well, we don't drive or we don't go out as much. Guess we're not going to take that flight on that holiday to Bali this year. We could cut back, and even if we paid 20-30% more for our food maximum, it didn't harm us as much. We just didn't eat out as much. But these poor people starved to death. So I was getting letters from World Vision for an entire year when this price of fuel and oil was so high. They were saying there's all these starving people, they can't afford to feed themselves. Not because of lack of food, it was more the people just couldn't afford food. Okay, so it's scary stuff to say things like, oh, just leave the oil in the ground. That's all right for you where you live in a Western country. And hey, let's face it, she's in Sweden. She travels around Europe. I mean, Europe, they subsidise their farmers. So their farmers are subsidised by the taxpayer to grow food. I mean, Christ, give me a break, girl. Now, here's another bit of her hypocrisy. She tells her parents not to fly planes because that's bad. That releases too much carbon dioxide. Okay, fair point. True. So she sails a boat, a $4 million luxury yacht to the United States to do a speech or two. Well, isn't that great? Now, she goes with 6 crew members, 6 members of her team, who then flew back to Germany from the United States. I mean, she would have been better off just flying with her dad. I mean, ridiculous. Now, for each flight, it's 1,800 kilograms of CO2 created. Just going back to Europe. Like, good on you, Greta. Anyway, but she's not the only one. There's Prince Harry of the British royal family and his lovely wife Meghan. I mean, they did 4 private plane trips in 11 days. And yet they're telling people about, you know, carbon emissions and, you know, all this sort of stuff. They're only going to have 2 kids because, you know, it's bad for the environment and all this stuff. Once again, they're another couple who say things, but they do exactly the opposite. I mean, why aren't they talking about, if they're talking about CO2, what about the 10 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions created by China every year? Why aren't they talking about that? I mean, China emits double the CO2 that the United States does for the same dollar of GDP. I mean, they're pretty inefficient. Why isn't anybody talking about that? You know, what about real pollution, for goodness sake? Where's the talk of this? You know, what about pollution like plastic bottles? Plastic bottles, okay. China dumps 8.8 million tonnes of plastic into the oceans every year. Now, our nearest neighbour, Indonesia, they dump 3.2 million tonnes of plastic in the ocean every year. I mean, I had a mate who went surfing in Bali recently, and he said, oh my God, man, he says, just plastic bags and crap and bottles everywhere in the water in Indonesia. And yeah, why aren't we talking about that? That's real pollution. Hey, you go to the Maldives, the beautiful Maldives, there's an island, a massive island of bottles. Hey, it's on YouTube. There's a woman on a bloody paddleboard trying to paddleboard through this massive island of bottles and crap. I mean, why aren't we talking about plastic bottles instead of CO2? But I guess it's easy to talk about CO2. You make yourself feel good because you don't have to give up anything in your life, do you? I mean, I don't see people giving up their cars. I see a lot of people who preach stuff about this stuff and they don't put solar power on their house. Okay, so you're not giving up your car. You still have your mobile phone. You still got the lights on at night. You know, that's coal-fired power. You know, once again, do as I say, not as I do. You know, or, you know, the same people love to eat out at restaurants. That's one of the biggest creators of carbon in this country. They also fly interstate and go on holidays and say, oh, you should travel more. Well, I've been overseas to Europe. I went once when I was 34. Great trip, I liked it, but I don't need to travel all the time. Okay, I don't need to pollute all the time. But I mean, you're looking at plastic. Well, people say, well, what about America? It's a big polluter. Okay, well, look at plastic. They dump 0.3 million tonnes of plastic bottles in the ocean, okay? Indonesia does more than 10 times that. We should be looking at our nearest neighbour. I mean, we give them over $300 million a year in aid. I mean, couldn't we encourage them to do something about that? I mean, Australians recycle pretty well. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't tell them what to do. Maybe just not give them aid and not tell them to do anything. But I mean, I look at another guy, another one, Al Gore, you know, Mr. Inconvenient Truth. You know, he had a net worth of $1.7 million in the year 2000, and now he's got a net worth of well over $200 million. He's basically a leader, I would say, of the environmental industrial complex. Basically, they're getting money off taxpayers or making governments borrow money to buy into this climate change stuff and subsidise supposedly green energy. And I can tell you now, there's nothing green about a lot of these solar panels. I mean, I've got REA solar panels on my roof, and I feel bad that I actually bought them, because in 2011, REA, a Chinese company, it's in the top 3 biggest suppliers of solar panels in Australia. So I thought it was a reputable company. I was told they had a great reputation. Well, in 2011, they dumped a hell of a lot of toxic waste into the water system, and their workers of their factory actually protested against their own company because their water came from underground. It was poisoning them and their children. Their children were getting sick, they're getting ill. And the Chinese, lovely Communist Party of China, well, they sent their police in there who were in beautiful camouflage uniforms, as I saw in the photos, and sticks at least 5 foot long, and beat the crap out of women and men who were simply protesting because they didn't have clean drinking water anymore. So this stuff that they make isn't exactly green, guys, okay? But I do have 5.4 kilowatt system on my roof, and, you know, there's my bit of virtue signalling for the year. Yeah, whoopity-doo. I mean, all I've done is replace one type of energy with another, but still, it is dirty because I know this stuff has polluted. So just be aware of that when you buy these things. Oh, and by 2030, I heard a scientific report on the news on 4BC. They were talking about scientists are concerned because there'll be 1,500 kilotons of solar panel waste that'll have to be dumped in Australia. It's pretty scary because these panels don't last forever. I mean, after 20 years, you'd be lucky to have 80% capacity in these things, and then they slowly go down and down and down. They just don't work very well anymore. Then you got to get new ones, okay? So they don't last forever. They don't power as much as they used to, okay? But anyway, yeah, look at these guys like Al Gore. You know, he's the same. He's basically got a hedge fund going where, you know, people are investing money. He says, oh, it's green technology. We're investing sustainably. Well, he's now got a net worth of over $200 million. And with his profits from this, he's bought himself a 6,500 square feet mansion, seafront mansion, mind you, in California, which actually consumes 35 times the amount of energy that the average American household does. So another one of these do as I say, not as you do type activists. And another activist close to my heart, because I am a Catholic, Pope Francis. Well, this guy's the biggest BSer of the year. I'm putting him right up there. He's totally, I mean, I don't think he's above criticism either. I mean, he came out with a lovely paper in June 2015, and he accompanied it with a news conference, and the subject was On Care for Our Common Home. That's beautiful. He talks about consumerism, irresponsible development, environmental degradation, and global warming. Now, he's the same guy who's recommended that European countries and America open their gates to refugees and stuff like this from the third world. Now, if he knew anything about consumerism, as he talked about it, he'd know that people in the third world consume, on average, 10% of what people in developed nations consume. So when you consume products, well then, boom, don't your emissions go up? I thought they would. But maybe not according to this guy. But he's recommending do this. Now, another spiritual leader, Dalai Lama, says, yeah, take refugees, but educate them, give them skills, send them back to their own country where they can develop their nation. I think that's a great idea. I want to see the working class and middle class lifted up all over the world. And if you take away sizable amounts of populations from third world countries or developing countries, guess what happens? Their economy goes south, because you need people to create growth, okay? But a lot of people don't understand this. But anyway, so it's interesting. Pope Francis, he says, should take these people. Well, look at the Vatican City where he lives. He talks about an open door policy for the Western world, but what does he do? He lives behind big walls. He has massive security teams armed with automatic weapons. And how many refugees has the Vatican taken recently in the last year or two? Any guesses? A big fat zero. A big fat zero, people. So once again, do as I say, not as I do. So in conclusion, you might think I'm just bagging out people, but what is the solution? Well, here's the solution that I've done. This is just what I've done. I think it might help in a tiny way. But I support World Vision. I sponsor a child. I have sponsored a child in another country before, in South Africa. But I sponsor a child in Myanmar, Burma. There he is. He's 17 now. Started sponsoring when he was about 8 or 9 years old. And you'll say, well, why sponsor a child in an obscure country like Myanmar? Well, I'll tell you why. Consumerism, as Pope Francis mentioned. Let's look at Australia. Our biggest selling vehicles are the Ford Ranger, dual cab four-wheel drive, and the Toyota Hilux, all made in Thailand. Another big seller is the Mitsubishi Triton. These are popular vehicles on our roads, guys. They're the new favourite family car because we no longer have a automotive manufacturing company at all in Australia. Well, not making mainstream passenger cars anyway. So the reason why I sponsor a child there is because they get poor people from Myanmar to go and work in Thailand, and they even have children who are stolen from this country, and they go to Thailand and they work in industries which basically benefit the Australian consumer. So yes, you can get your lovely big fat dual cab 4-wheel drive at the expense of some poor little kid from Burma or Thailand, or adult for that matter. Great. Now, eventually I think, this sort of capitalism will help grow a better working class, middle class perhaps in Thailand, but at the moment there are people being basically screwed over and getting paid very little so that you can have cheaper motor vehicles. Yes, lucky you. Now, I don't own an imported vehicle. In my household I have 2 second-hand Australian built cars, but if you wish to help those who help us, obviously by supplying us with cheap, decent vehicles, well, maybe it's a good idea to help lift up those people instead of going to these global activist strikes and marching the street and demanding our government does something. How about for the carton of, say, the price of a carton of beer or carton of craft beer a month, you could actually help lift up a child and help them have their own family business. You could give them education. Also, they do a lot of child protection programs. That is becoming a massive issue for World Vision now. A bigger and bigger proportion every year of their funding goes towards stopping child trafficking. And the reason there is so much child trafficking is because the West is desiring all these consumer goods, and obviously cheap labour is used to make these things, and who else better to exploit than children and women and men in developing nations. So it's pretty harsh, but I think that's pretty much a good sum of it. So do your bit, do what you can, and try to be someone who, walks the talk. Don't be a hypocrite like Greta Thunberg, Al Gore, Prince Harry, or even Pope Francis. God bless him. Anyway, all the best and stay awesome.